Welcome back to Logic. Let's jump into the material. We're going to start by talking about arguments. Here's an example of an argument. It's not philosophically profound, but it will teach us something important about their nature. Suppose I told you this. Suppose I said that every Thursday I have my favorite treat, and maybe it's something that looks delectable like this. I think I pulled this off of the Cold Stone website. This is probably a little too sweet for my taste, but there's a lot of good things going for it. Every Thursday I have this. This is my favorite treat. Every Thursday I have this, let's say. And I follow that with today, I will have my favorite treat. Some of you might conclude that based on this information, it must be Thursday. And if we were to say as much, that would be an argument, and a good argument at that, one that we might even call valid. That will be a special term that we talk about later in the course. But it turns out that given these two pieces of information or premises, we will call them, it doesn't necessarily follow that it's Thursday. If I had said only on Thursdays I have my favorite treat and I'm having it today, then it would have to be Thursday. But without that only, without specifying that, it might be a different day of the week. Suppose I am addicted to this sort of treat and I have it Thursday, but I also have it Wednesday and Friday and Saturday and Monday. I have it every day of the week or 5 days a week. It would, if I had it every day of the week, or if I had it every day of the week, it certainly would follow that I would have it Thursday. I'd have it every Thursday, right? If I have it every day, then I have it Thursday. And it would also follow that if I have this treat every day, I would be having it today. So, given that possibility, we don't know what day of the week it is. It might be Thursday, but it doesn't have to be. And if you were to conclude or deduce as much, you would be committing a fallacy. You would be making a logical mistake. So what I just gave you is an example of a misleading argument. The conclusion we didn't explicitly state, hence the ellipses here. But even though it ends up being an invalid argument or a bad argument or a misleading argument, it's still an argument nonetheless. So what is an argument in general? We started with this specific example. Well, there's several ways to define it. This is a particularly good one. An argument is a set or group of statements, and it always has two parts. And we talked about this before. An argument has to have a conclusion, and it has to have at least one premise. And if it has more than one, then it has premises. And it can have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 12, 15, 100, theoretically an unlimited number of premises. What is the job of the premises? The premises are there to provide support for the conclusion. So if you think of this like a house, the premises are the support beams, and the conclusion maybe is the structure atop those support beams, maybe a higher floor or a roof or something. Or you could think of the premises as a foundation, and the conclusion rests upon that foundation. If the foundation isn't strong enough, if it's shaky, then there's not enough support. And that's like building a house on sand. It can sink or collapse. The job of the conclusion is to be the statement that is allegedly supported. So in a good argument, you have premises that adequately support the conclusion. And in a bad argument, that support just isn't there. So that's our definition of argument, this group or set of statements. One of them we'll call the conclusion. That is the one that is allegedly supported, and the others we'll call the premises, and they're alleged or claimed to provide support for the conclusion. I just realized I wasn't sharing my screen. So my cursor was pointing to things that you could not see. So here is that image of this delectable dessert treat thing. And here's the Thursday argument. Again, given this information, it doesn't necessarily follow that it's Thursday. If some of you might read this first statement as only on Thursday I have my favorite treat, but it doesn't say that. It just says all Thursdays, and it doesn't have to be only Thursday. And here's that definition of argument. There was a reading from another textbook authored by Copey, another famous textbook in logic, who talks about statements versus propositions and the distinction between them and sentences. So we'll set that aside for right now. Let's go to another argument for practice. Again, this isn't philosophically deep, but we're warming up, trying to understand the basic idea of argumentation. Again, the relationship between philosophy, logic, and arguments. It's an important one. So one of the main tools that a philosopher has in making philosophical progress, is by writing their ideas down, expressing their ideas, and they often come in the form of arguments. So you have philosophers from the Middle Ages who thought they could, through reason alone, prove the existence of God. So their conclusion would be something theological, like God must exist. And they try to come up with premises that support the idea of God's existence. And in their minds, they thought they had succeeded. They thought they had provided not only an argument for the divine, but a good argument, a valid argument, a sound argument, a proof, we might call it, for the existence of God. And of course, that was challenged by many and accepted by some. So that's the point, is that one of the main ways that over the millennia philosophers have made progress in the field is by expressing their ideas. They often are expressed in terms of arguments. And so if we are going to evaluate the merit of any particular idea or philosophy, we have to be good at analyzing and evaluating arguments. And at the heart of a good argument is sound and valid logic. And so we have to be able to identify and categorize the good from the bad, the logical from the illogical, the wheat from the chaff, if you will. So here's another argument. This one isn't very interesting, but it's an argument, and it is a good argument. So we'll take me, Ryan. I live in California, like many of you, probably all of you, maybe not all of you, but probably. And that's my premise. And I conclude, therefore, I live in the United States. I live in California, therefore I live in the United States. Kind of a no-brainer throwaway argument, but an argument nonetheless. And this one is good. It's good for two reasons. One, the premise is true. There's only one premise. Technically, there's two premises because there's an implied premise here. That's why I have an asterisk here. When I say California, I don't mean California. If there's a California, I don't know, there might be a California in another country, maybe another Latin American country has a California. Maybe there's a California, Canada, probably not, but so we have to specify the California is the one that we know and love, the one that's in the United States, and then it would have to follow that. That's where I live. A lot of times we argue orally or in writing without being explicit about every little nut and bolt, we don't explicitly state every single premise, as is the case with that one. And just for your information, when you do that, a lot of times in a conversation, there's things that are implied, things that are left unsaid, and they still get communicated for the most part. We only have so much time in the day, right? So we can't delineate every little thing. We think quickly, we talk, we speak quickly, and so it's a shorthand often the time. But so the name for doing that, for providing an argument where there are unstated, implicit, or implied premises, is called an enthymeme. Now, you might have noticed that when I read the argument, I actually inserted a word that's not there. I said hence or therefore. So there are these special words that indicate that a conclusion or premise is nearby. I live in California, hence, or thus, or therefore, I live in the United States. So those are examples of conclusion indicators. So these words on the right-hand side, these words indicate a conclusion. So they're usually attached to the conclusion. Let's say you have a friend that lives in Florida. So hence, this implies they're a Floridian, right? Or they're an American, just like us, Or you have a friend that lives in Ottawa. So thus, hence, consequently, they're a Canadian. If they have maybe we should say, living there isn't a sufficient condition for being a Canadian. You have to have, if they're a citizen of Ottawa, then they're a Canadian. That would be better, right? The words here on the left are are premise indicators. Premise indicators. Since, because, given. This follows from, this is implied by. So these are signal words. These are clue words. They help you categorize the parts of every argument. Sometimes you won't see any of these words. Sometimes you'll see one of each. Sometimes you'll only see a premise indicator and there's no conclusion indicator. But as you practice identifying arguments, you'll get better at identifying these and identifying premises and conclusions, whether or not they are there. Okay, so practice makes perfect. So let's do a little bit of practice. So we're going to go to the textbook and we are going to go. Sorry for all the window changing. So on our syllabus here, I've broken down the reading, the section and subsection of the text, and then the problems and the problem sets that I want you to turn in. So what you'll do is you will, it says you read the corresponding sections before completing the problems. So a lot of you have probably read section 1.1. Section 1.2 is optional, but I recommend it. And you might have gone further and read section 1.3. And so after you read that, then you'll go to the subsections and work through some of these problems. And we'll go through a bunch of these together. And then the rest you'll be on your own. So we'll practice together, to get you trained enough to do the work on your own, right? That's how you learn. Hey, great. So, and just as a preview, eventually we're going to have exams, right? So we're slated to have 3 exams in this course. So once we get through chapter 2, then we'll have an exam. And so what you'll do is you'll turn in all of this homework in one batch, in one what I call homework packet. And that will, that'll go toward your grade. So your grade will be based on the work you put into the practice sets, and of course how you do on the exam. All right, let's do some of these problems. Let's go to the very beginning. Let's switch these around. There we go. Okay. So 1.1. And let's jump to so 2. I'll let you do that one on your own. Let's practice together with number 4. No, sorry. No, we'll do 2 together. So this is an argument from a book called Philosophy and the Human Spirit. I actually haven't read it, but I'm sure it's perfectly fine. So here's the argument, and it's contained in one sentence, short and sweet. I like that. Since the good, according to Plato, is that which furthers a person's real interests, it follows that in any given case where the good is known, men will seek it. As you can see, I've highlighted the word since and the phrase it follows that. So what are the instructions in this section? You have to identify the premise or premises and the conclusion. And you use P for premise and C for conclusion, and list the premises in the order in which they make the most sense. Often it's the order that they occur. So what would this look like? Well, indicator words may be eliminated once premises and conclusions have appropriately be labeled. Okay. If you include them, I don't care. That's fine. You won't be docked for that. But we have some indicator words. Remember, since. You think, okay, in that list, let's go to our list. I remember since was on there. Okay, it's on this list. Which was this? This is the premise indicator list. So that tells me that what's attached to the since is the premise. So the premise is this first statement. It follows that. Let's see, is that on this? Ooh, this follows from. That's close, but no, it follows that. That's over here. That's a conclusion indicator. So what's attached to this part, that's the conclusion. And so you could write it out like this. So we could put P for premise, and notice that I've dropped the premise indicator, the since, but you could leave it in if you wanted to. That doesn't matter to me. And then here's the conclusion. So there, we got an argument. Is it any good? Well, to evaluate an argument, you have to do 2 things. You have to look at the premises and ask yourselves, is it actually true? Is it true that the good, according to Plato, is that to which furthers a person's real interests? So this is interesting because there's this part, the good is what furthers a person's real interests. Okay, so you could think about that. I mean, there might be some vagueness there. We're going to talk about that later in the course. But if something furthers your interest, that's good. And, that sounds right. Everyone has interests, and you pursue them. And if there's something that aids you in your pursuit of them, or helps you achieve your interests, then you'd say that's good. Okay, that sounds right. And then there's the according to Plato part, which is more of an empirical question. We talked about that last time. Well, did Plato say this or not? So we'd have to go ask a Platonic scholar. In any given case, when the good is known, men will seek it. Okay, kind of vague statement, but okay, so people seek good things. All right, I mean, that sounds fairly true, but is that supported by this statement? And anyway, we'd have a philosophical debate about it. If there is support there, then we have a pretty decent argument. Okay, let's move on. So we've got 4, 6, 8, 9. So again, I won't do all of these. Let's jump to 8. So you can do 4 and 6 on your own. We'll do some of these together. So we did 2 together, and we're also going to do 8 together right now. The classroom teacher is crucial to the development and academic success of the average student. Oops, I'm biased. That seems right. And administrators simply are ancillary, like kind of on the side piece or side. They do the side work to this effort. For this reason, classroom teachers ought to be paid at least the equivalent of administrators at all levels, including the superintendent. Letter to the editor. So you could see this is probably written by a teacher. Teachers, are they paid as much as administrators? I've never heard of a school where they do that. That would be interesting. Yeah, for the most part, the administrators make way more than the teachers, and maybe there's good reasons for that. But this person thinks, hey, the heart of the work, the heart of education, of educating people, young people and adults, is at the point of the classroom, and so that's where the money the focus should go, and then everything else should be more supportive. That's kind of their argument. It's a decent argument. Now, we're not so much evaluating these arguments in this assignment. We are more just trying to get at the structure. So what's the conclusion and what is the supporting statements, the premises? We have for this reason. Let's see, is that on our list? It's not, but this isn't the be all end all of indicators. So let's think, for this reason, does that sound like a conclusion, or does that sound like a conclusion indicator or a premise indicator? For this reason, well, it's like here, I've just stated something. I've just concluded something. The reason, that's the evidence. We've even called premises reasons. For these reasons, for these premises. So the reason was just stated, right? For this reason. What was the reason? Well, the teacher is crucial to academic success for the student, and administrators, they're just kind of ancillary. They're on the side. So that's the reason. So that's the premise. And then here's the conclusion. Pay teachers at least as much as administrators. So not even like low-level administrators, even the people at the very top, the superintendent. So what I've highlighted here, that's the conclusion. So if we look at 8 here, teachers should be paid just as much as administrators. And there's two ways to do the premises here. You could combine these into one premise and just put and between them. That would be fine. It's also equivalent to divide them into 2 statements. Either way is acceptable. So the first reason is the teachers, that's what's crucial. That's what's crucial for the academic success. And then here's a little bit more information. Administrators, not as crucial. They're ancillary. Okay, so if you just put P1 and then you put these 2 statements together into an and, I find that perfectly acceptable. But if you want to separate them, that's great too. All right, so let's do 14. So you can do 9 and 10 on your own. So you see, I'm doing, on average, a quarter, a third, a half of them. It depends on the exercise. So it looks like there's a lot of problems that you're going to have to do throughout the term. However, we're going to do a lot together. And so you're not as responsible for as many as you might think. Also, if you didn't notice, any of the assigned problems that are starred, the answers are in the back of the textbook. And so, feel free to use that to, obviously, try it on your own first. That would be the best policy, but it's a great way to check your work. And then the ones with the stars, you know, you try it on your own, and you know, in other videos or over discussion boards, we can go over some of the tough ones. Okay, let's go to 14 here. Now, this is a very philosophical. We're getting away from Ryan lives in kind of argument, and every Thursday I have this treat. All right, this is from a very famous philosopher, St. Thomas Aquinas. To everything existing, God wills some good. Okay, so there's all these things that exist. And this premise is saying, I'm already giving away that it's a premise, is that, you know, basically everything that, so God exists, and everything that God created, there's some goodness, you know, that's kind of imbued into it. Hence, since. Now, this is a trip, hence, comma, since. So we have two indicators here. The hence, that's a conclusion indicator, right? That's over here. And then the since, that's a premise indicator. So there's going to be a premise and a conclusion that it follows these words, and it's kind of tough to figure out which is which. Well, the part that immediately follows the since, that's going to be another premise. To love anything is nothing else than to will good to that thing. So everything that is loved. So if you love something, you will good to that thing. Okay, I mean, that's kind of vague, but that sounds right. And then after the comma, that's what the hence is really attached to. So here's a premise. And then after the since to this comma, another premise. And then after this comma, the conclusion. And so what you end up with is this premise. To every existing thing, God wills some good. And to love anything, it's nothing else than to will good to that thing. So then it would follow, it is manifest that God loves everything that exists. Hey, well, that makes sense. Of course, a saint is going to endorse the idea that God is all loving, right? A Christian saint, so we shouldn't be surprised. Is this a good argument? That's neither here nor there, but it is an argument. And here are the premises, the statements that are claimed to support this conclusion. All right, that's enough for section 111. Let's see here. Let's go to 1.2. So what are you supposed to do in 1.2? You're supposed to read this and see, did I do this? Where did I go? Oh, here. These are long form expressions of ideas. They do contain an argument. It's your job to figure out what's the conclusion. Write out what you interpret the main conclusion to be. So you read. So these aren't as short and sweet, and they're from magazine and newspaper editorials, letters to the editor. Sometimes you have to rephrase the conclusion. Okay, so this is a cool one. So for my PhD, I wrote about morality, moral responsibility, and free will. And that really is at the heart of this letter to the editor from Rosenthal. Okay, what does he say? A person cannot reject free will and still insist on criminality and codes of moral behavior. Let's think about that for a second. Okay, what is free will? Free will. And what is free will? It's the ability to do what you want. It is there's things that I have no control over, right? I can't control the weather. I can't control the past. But there are some things that I do have power over and some control over. I have choices, and I come to forks in the road, decision points, and the the path that's taken is in part because of a decision that I made. Free will. I know. I try to give like an off the cuff, off the top of my head of what someone on the street might say about free will. So if you reject the idea of free will, maybe because you believe there are these physical laws that govern everything and they're deterministic, something like that. So if you reject free will, or maybe you think, maybe you believe in God and you think God knows everything, including the future. But then if God knows the future, that means that we're all locked into and pigeonholed into the future. And the future, there's one future, one unique future, and it's inescapable and unavoidable. And that means that we can't, there's no leeway, there's no wiggle room away from that future. We're locked into it. And if I'm destined to do something bad, let's say, commit some crime or to do something immoral, then that immoral act is inescapable. It's unavoidable. And does it make sense to blame me for something that I can't avoid? That's starting to sound like I don't have control. If I can't avoid it, then it's not really me choosing it. It's me being kind of forced into it. And that's what this person is saying in this first line, which I'm going to say that's the conclusion. That's the conclusion. And so they support it by what follows. If people are compelled by forces beyond their control, genes or the environment. So I talked about deterministic laws of nature, but another way to think about limits or things that get in the way, hurdles to our free will, is if you think about how behavior seems to be in part determined by our parents, our genes, our DNA, hereditary factors. Okay. And the environment. So sometimes experiences, especially, trauma and very early on in our lives, that can really shape us as a person. So if you have some horrible experiences when you're young, and then later in life, you kind of fall by the wayside, and you start to make bad decisions, how much of those bad decisions are really rooted in that early childhood trauma? 20%, 50%, 100%, it's hard to say. But if you really lean into both of those things, then you might say there's not much room for free will. So that's what they're saying in this line here. Then if you lean so much into that the free will evaporates, well, then more responsibility evaporates. And then there's no point in really having a criminal justice system. There's no point in imprisoning people because it's not their fault. It's their genes' fault, their environment's fault. Their actions, all of a sudden, they're totally excusable, no matter how immoral or vile they are. And that includes like the worst things you can think of. So think about the Holocaust. That's the Nuremberg trials of the Nazi murderers. So after World War II, basically these Nazi commanders, of course, Hitler died in the war. So, the world couldn't put Hitler on trial, but there still were all these Nazi higher ups that survived the war. And so it's like, what are we going to do with these people? And so they had these trials in this place called Nuremberg. And so they're called these famous Nuremberg trials. And like, all right, well, the world's watching. What are we going to do with these Nazi war criminals? And there, of course, were all these, punishments and consequences and imprisonments. But if free will goes out the window, then all of these sentences for these heinous murderers, they're all invalid. And the prison, we should open up the prison gates. That's what this person is arguing. The essence of our humanity is the ability to choose between right and wrong, good and evil, and act accordingly. So that's free will. If you take that away, if you strip that away from someone, then we're just animals and we're just acting on instinct. We don't have free will. We're not persons. We're just kind of meat machines. That's what this person's arguing. And they really start with the conclusion is that if you reject free will, then morality goes out the window and all criminal judgments are invalid. And so you should not insist on them. So you cannot consistently do both. You can't reject free will and insist on moral codes and criminality. So yeah, that's the conclusion. Okay. So that's cool. We got to do a little bit of logic, and we got to do a little bit of moral responsibility, right? We talked about the areas of philosophy before. And so I said that we use the logic branch, the logic ideas in logic, as a vehicle, as a tool to make progress in the other areas. And ethics was one of them. So we just did a little bit of overlap. So that was great. Okay. So that was 7. All right, let's go a little bit further here. So let's go to 114 and 5. Okay, so 114 is a bunch of true, false statements. So all we have to do is say true or false. Okay, let's go through some of these. So you have to do 1, 3, 4, 5, 9. And maybe I'll go through all of these. We'll see how I feel in this moment. The purpose of the premise or premises is to set forth the reasons or evidence given in support of the conclusion. Totally. That's exactly how we defined premises or a premise. That's right on the money. So that's true. 3, all arguments must have more than one premise. That's false. An argument can have one premise. That's fine. And now, okay, here's a question. Can an argument have 0 premises? That's a little bit, that depends a little bit more on your definition of argument. So you could have a perfectly fine definition of argument where when we kind of are doing this in our class, where an argument has to have a conclusion and at least one premise. Now, would there be any pushback on that definition from many philosophers or logicians, people who study logic? Well, you might get some pushback. You might say, well, technically, there are some theorems in philosophy, logic, maybe even mathematics, where they're still an argument and you can prove that they're valid even though they don't have any premises. And you might say, how is that possible? Well, the way that theorems work is they're almost obviously true, sometimes almost trivially true. And the way that you prove that you're true is in this indirect way. What you do is you say, look, this statement that we're claiming is a theorem, look, it has to be true. It has to. And if somebody says, why? You might say, well, for fun, imagine that it were false and see what happens. If you assume that it's false, it leads to madness. It leads to absurdity. It leads to inconsistency, incoherence. And anything that leads to inconsistency or a logical contradiction is necessarily false. So it's like a roundabout way of confirming the statement in the first place. You say, well, the false version of that statement is false. So the original statement must be true. So for 3, we're going to say false. You can have an argument with one premise only, maybe even 0. But for our class, you don't have to worry about theorems. So we'll do them way later in the term. But yeah, they definitely don't need 2, right? So you can see 3 here, false. All right, the words therefore, hence, so, since, thus are all conclusion indicators. Yeah, they're on this list here, aren't they? Yeah. The words for, because, as, for the reason that are all premise indicators. For the reason that, well, that's going to be true. Because premise. For the fact that, I might add to these, the fact that, for the reason that because A, B, and C, as such, so I don't particularly like this question so much. So I would have had something more like the on the list here. But that's okay. Look, hey, there's an author of this textbook, and there's me, and there's a lot of convergence, but not always. What are you gonna do? Every statement has a truth value by definition. Yeah, so 9's going to be true as well. A statement is so this is where the copy reading comes into play. So we start with sentences, and sentences can be in different languages. And if you say, like if I were to say, I don't know why it's about my head, like it's over there, so if you said that, say in Spanish, I don't know what it's like. It's like estás allá, something like that. So those two things have the same meaning, and what they have in common, that meaning, that's the statement or proposition. So statements or propositions are the semantics, they are the meanings of sentences. And even though some sentences can be questions or commands or exclamations, like ouch, that's a sentence, but it's an exclamation. Or what time is it? That's a sentence, but it's a interrogative, it's a question. Or take out the trash, or don't touch that. That is a command, that's an imperative. So those are all sentences, but they are not declarative sentences. And so statements and propositions, those are the meanings of declarative sentences. And declarative sentences, their meaning is such that they're either true or false. That's what having a truth value means. All right, let's wrap things up here. Let's look at 5, 1, 2, and then we'll call it. 5, 1, 2. We're still in 1, 1. It's a little bit tough with the subsections, so it's part 1. 1, 1 of part 1, and then it's like subsection 5 of 1, 1. But that's it's all makes me think of like the Dewey Decimal. Is it Dewey or just Dewey Decimal System? I haven't thought about that in so long. I have to think about it. I'm gonna go Dewey Decimal. I don't know if there's 2 Deweys. That's my final answer. Okay. 5, 1, 2. Oh yeah. So this one, you'll do these more on your own. I'll kind of walk through one of them. So what you'll do is you're going to create your own arguments. So we have been learning about arguments, and we have been dissecting them and analyzing them, but we haven't created our own arguments. So for 1 and 2 here, you are given conclusions. So take this conclusion: uniforms should, you got to pick which side. Uniforms should not be required in high school. So you don't have to do both. I mean, if you want, you do both, but just pick one. So do you think that like in like private schools oftentimes have uniforms, not all of them, but public schools sometimes they have uniforms, but usually you have free dress. That's what they used to call it. I don't know if they still call it that. So maybe that's a requirement. Well, there's reasons for and there's reasons not. And when you do that, you're giving an argument. So what are some of the reasons? Well, when there's no uniforms, there are some issues. So, if there was any gang issues, in the school, not, that doesn't have to be everywhere, but sometimes, people wear colors that represent certain gangs and get in trouble. If you have a uniform, then you help mitigate against that problem. There's teasing and bullying based on clothes, so if you're not wearing these cool clothes, then you get picked on and bullied. Well, if it's a uniform, then that kind of goes away. And then you just look at empirically schools that went from no uniforms to uniforms. How did it change the environment? Did it help? And there's probably some data that suggests that it does. Yeah, there's something maybe more a little bit more serious about uniforms. Like, you're here not to fool around. You're here to do your education. You have to take your education seriously. And when you do something, when you take something seriously, and when you're doing something serious, you often dress up. And that the function of one of the functions of dressing up is showing that, hey, we're not messing around here. Um, we're not just kind of easy breezy, casually doing something for fun. This is serious. Think about the criminal justice system. So sometimes, in states where there is the death penalty, a judge has to speak the words, "I'm sentencing you to death," right? And if imagine if the person, okay, so the person, okay, they did, usually this is reserved for, people that do the worst things, right? So like a murderer. But imagine if okay, you're still a person, you still a citizen, you still have the right to a fair trial. And what if the judge came in like, one of those white A shirts that has that horrible dysphomism, and, like board shorts and flip flops, and like the hair was all messed up, and it's kind of like not even seems like they care that much. It's like, oh yeah, you're gonna get the chair, you're gonna get lethal induction. There's just something not quite right about that. It's like, at least respect that you're going to sign a death warrant on someone. At least have the respect and dignity, to dress up. And they do. Judges, they wear these formal robes. Yeah, so there's something to that. And in the business world, people wear business attire. They wear a lot of suits are worn, and ties. It's a sign of respect. I was watching, I think, Curb Your Enthusiasm, if any of you know that show. There's an episode, I think I might be getting this mixed up, but this is from a long time ago. But there's a guy who wants to, a very wealthy person who wants to move all his money out of one firm to another firm. And he gets his recommendation, I think, from Larry David, the main character in that show. And this guy, he's older. He's like in his 70s or 80s. I think he was played by Ed Asner, who passed away recently. And the guy says, "Oh yeah, you're recommended to me. I'm going to move. I want to move. I got millions of dollars in these accounts. I'm not happy with my current firm, and I've heard good things. So let's talk about moving it to your firm. But you need to sell me on your firm, and you got to show me that you guys are going to do things right." But the older character, he ends up walking out of the meeting because he came in on a Friday, and the firm was having casual Friday, and the guy is wearing, like blue jeans, and this guy's like, "How could this is millions of dollars. Like, you're wearing blue. Like, this is like, if you're gonna, it's like, how do I know you're gonna, this is serious. This is like a big deal." And so, and maybe there, younger people will say, what's the function of that? It doesn't do, like, what does it matter? We all have to be uncomfortable and wear these, it's like literally choking you. And then there's something to that. Anyway, so that's an example of how you might, create an argument for this one. And this one down here, number 2, the drinking age. Hey, that's an interesting one. So it's 21 in California. It's actually not in the Constitution that it has to be 21. I think there's some states where it's not 21. But what people always say, hey, what's the heck? I can join the military and then go off and fight in a war and die for my country at 18, but I can't have a beer when I get back. So that's a pretty decent argument. So you might do something like that. And on the other side of it, people say, well, the human brain, we reach kind of, our bodies are fully mature at 18, but our brains aren't fully developed yet. So we don't have that full agency, that full capacity to reason sufficiently. Yeah. And I think I've even heard that neurologically, the male brain, I don't know, this is an empirical question, right? It's not a philosophical one. The male brain takes even longer. It's like late 20s or something. So that's what you might say on the flip side of that. All right. Thank you very much. That's all I have. I'll see you next time.